The neighborhood of Pine Ridge Estates had always been known for its manicured lawns, quiet streets, and the faint smell of cedar drifting in the air during summer evenings. It was the kind of place where everyone waved politely, even if no one really talked. That peace, however, began to crack the day she became president of the Homeowners Association. Her real name was Karen Whitmore, but soon enough, everyone in the neighborhood came to call her HOA Karen, and not behind her back either. The title fit too perfectly. Karen had always been ambitious, overly ambitious. The moment she took control of the HOA board, she began creating new rules. Grass was to be trimmed to exactly 2 inches in height. House colors were restricted to approved neutral tones. Porch furniture was limited to 2 chairs, no benches, no swings. Every rule came with a fine, and Karen enforced those fines like a general preparing for war. But the real chaos began when Karen unveiled her biggest project yet, a life-sized marble statue of herself, placed right in the center of the community's main roundabout. The statue stood tall, chin raised, hands at her hips in a pose that, in her mind, symbolized leadership. To everyone else, it looked like someone who had never heard the word humble in her life. When the statue appeared, residents were speechless. Some laughed, assuming it was a temporary decoration. Some shook their heads, too tired to fight another ridiculous decision. But Karen wasn't finished. The next HOA meeting introduced a new rule. All residents were required to acknowledge the symbol of community unity when passing the statue. In other words, they had to salute it. Of course, the community was stunned. A few neighbors exchanged confused whispers during the meeting. Others tried to object, but Karen had already prepared. She wielded the HOA bylaws like weapons, twisting language to justify the new rule. Refusal to salute the statue? $75 fine each time. Multiple refusals? Mandatory disciplinary review with the HOA board. Karen stood on the stage smiling, clearly pleased with herself. She believed she was building a legacy, an image of strength and authority that would be remembered for generations. In truth, she had become something else entirely. A tyrant with a mailbox key. And Pine Ridge Estates was about to find out just how far she was willing to go to protect the empire she believed she had built. At first, the residents tried to ignore the statue. They drove around it without looking. They walked past it with stiff necks. And they avoided eye contact with Karen whenever she lingered nearby, always watching, always judging. But Karen anticipated their resistance. She stationed a rotating group of HOA compliance monitors, halfway disguised as friendly volunteers. In reality, they were her loyal followers, neighbors who had either been manipulated, intimidated, or bribed with things like free HOA fee waivers and garden pass approvals. They took notes every hour. License plate numbers of cars that didn't slow down and salute. Descriptions of joggers who passed by without making the required gesture. Photos of dog walkers who pretended to bend down to tie a shoe instead. By the end of the first week, 62 violation notices had been delivered. Each envelope was crisp and official-looking, sealed with the HOA emblem that Karen had redesigned shortly after taking office, an emblem that, unsurprisingly, now included a silhouette of her statue. The community group chat exploded with messages. Has she lost her mind? I am not saluting anything. We need to fight this. But fighting the HOA was complicated. The bylaws were dense, written in legal jargon, and layered with loopholes that Karen exploited like a seasoned strategist. The few residents who tried to go through official channels quickly found themselves buried in paperwork and procedural blocks. Then came the Browns. Harold and Linda Brown were retired school teachers who had lived in the neighborhood for 26 years. They were calm, respected, and known for hosting the best 4th of July cookouts. When they received their first violation for simply walking their poodle, Baxter, without pausing at the statue, they refused to pay. Karen pounced. She showed up at their door in person, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a thin line. Refusal to comply with community unity regulations, she recited, loud enough for nearby neighbors to hear, will result in escalating fines and possible property lien. Harold didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply closed the door in her face. That was the moment the neighborhood realized something important. Karen relied on fear. And once fear cracked, control would follow. The Browns became the quiet spark of rebellion. Soon, others stopped paying their fines too. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before began holding secret backyard meetings, whispering plans over barbecue grills and lawn chairs. They were nervous, yes, but they were also tired. The question was no longer whether Karen had gone too far. It was how to stop her. Karen could feel the shift in the neighborhood long before anyone said anything out loud. Pine Ridge Estates, once docile and quiet, now carried a quiet tension. People were gathering without her approval. Faces were harder. Conversations stopped when she approached. And even the compliance volunteers seemed less confident. She sensed rebellion, and she was ready for war. The next HOA meeting was moved from the clubhouse to the community center hall. Karen claimed it was because attendance had grown. But everyone knew the truth. She wanted a stage. She showed up wearing a navy suit with gold buttons and a small enamel pin of her own statue on the lapel. The confidence in her stride wasn't confidence at all. It was desperation, disguised as authority. The room was full. Neighbors who had never attended a meeting now sat shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed. The Browns were there, sitting front and center. Harold looked calm. Linda held a folder full of printed documents. Karen stepped up to the microphone. "It has been brought to my attention," she began, her voice smooth but sharp, "that a number of residents are engaging in organized noncompliance. This behavior is unacceptable in a community built on unity, decorum, and mutual respect." A scoff came from the crowd. Karen ignored it. As such, the HOA will now be implementing enhanced enforcement measures. She lifted a stack of papers dramatically. This includes increased fines, mandatory community service for repeat offenders, and, if necessary, property assessment penalties. A wave of murmurs rolled across the room. Neck muscles tightened. Eyes narrowed. Harold Brown raised his hand. "Madam President," he said evenly, "are you aware that the HOA charter limits enforcement authority to matters directly affecting property maintenance? There is no clause that grants you the power to enforce symbolic gestures." Karen's smile twitched. "I am the elected head of the HOA. I have full discretionary authority to interpret the charter." Linda opened her folder. Papers shuffled. "Actually," Linda said, her voice clear and ringing in the room, "we found the original charter. Not the revised digital copy, the signed, notarized one from 26 years ago. You've been citing changes that were never officially ratified." Gasps. Whispers. A few people sat forward in their chairs. Karen's face went pale. Before she could respond, a door behind the room opened. A man in a county inspector's uniform stepped in, holding his own clipboard. "Karen Whitmore?" he asked. Karen swallowed. "Yes. We need to talk about that statue. We have received multiple complaints. It appears you installed it on public easement land without a permit." The room erupted. Cheers, laughter, disbelief, relief. Karen's grip on power was cracking, and everyone could see it. The days following the meeting were unlike anything Pine Ridge Estates had seen before. The county inspector's presence had done more than embarrass Karen. It had opened a legal investigation. Word spread quickly that the statue, Karen's towering symbol of control, was technically illegal. It was built on land owned jointly by the county and the HOA, and any such installation required permits, community approval, safety inspections, and architectural clearance. Karen had skipped all of that. Of course she had. For years, Karen had assumed she was untouchable. Rules were tools. Regulations were weapons. And she had believed that the quiet compliance of the neighborhood meant she was universally respected. In reality, fear had simply been waiting for the right moment to fracture. And fracture it did. Within 48 hours, the county issued an official order. The statue must be removed. Karen protested. She shouted. She wrote letters, made calls, filed appeals, demanded meetings. But the inspector had something stronger than her authority. Paperwork. Verified, stamped, legally binding paperwork. Meanwhile, the neighborhood felt something it hadn't felt in years. Unity. Genuine unity. The kind that comes from shared struggle. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now helping each other mow lawns, sharing meals, and laughing again. The Browns became something like community leaders, but not by force, simply by respect. On the morning the removal crew arrived, nearly every resident gathered around the roundabout. The The statue stood in the center like a monument to arrogance, still catching early daylight across its polished surface. Karen arrived seconds later, frantic, her hair undone, clutching a binder like it was a life raft. "You can't do this," she cried, running forward. "This statue represents our values." Harold Brown stepped forward. "Calm. Steady." "No," he said. "It represented your ego." The crowd murmured agreement, quiet but firm. The workers strapped thick nylon bands around the marble figure. The crane groaned as it lifted. For a moment, the statue seemed to resist, as if gravity itself wanted to preserve the absurdity. But then, slowly, inevitably, it rose off its pedestal. Some neighbors clapped. Some simply exhaled. A few shed tears of relief. Karen stood frozen, watching everything she had built crumble in real time. Her power had never been real. It had been borrowed, and now it was gone. By the end of the week, she had resigned from the HOA. By the end of the month, her house was up for sale. Life returned to Pine Ridge Estates. Peace, real peace, returned with it. The lawns were still trimmed, the porches still neat. But now, when neighbors waved, they meant it. And in the empty roundabout, flowers began to grow where the statue once stood.